Hello and welcome to this week's session, of this month's session of the digital webinar, Digital Materialities. It is a great pleasure to welcome Catherine Sutherland, Deputy Librarian of Magdalene College in Magdalene College Library in Cambridge. And because her name was tipped by Guyonne Ledic, I'll leave the floor to Guyonne to properly introduce Catherine's work and paper. Just a few words of housekeeping, but I'm sure everybody's completely aware of that. Just make sure your microphones are switched off, and then when it comes to question and Q&A, obviously do unmute yourself and ask your questions directly.
Thank you very much, Ariane. So I'm really very happy that Catherine Sutherland accepted our invitation because she recently identified many books that had been owned by Mary Astell, the philosopher and pre-feminist, nowadays well known, Mary Astell, 1666-1731. It is really a very important discovery for scholars, in particular in connection with Mary Astell's knowledge of French, gradual knowledge of French, especially of books by Descartes and Malebranche, which are really important in her theological exchanges with John Norris. But it is far more important as a whole, and not only concerning French books. So Catherine Sutherland is going to explain us nearly everything about her discoveries, and I hope that you will discover still more books in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. I will just share my screen now. I hope that's okay. Yes. So good afternoon. My name is Catherine Sutherland and I'm the Deputy Librarian of the Pepys Library and Special Collections at Magdalene College Cambridge in the UK. Many thanks for inviting me to speak today. My paper focuses on my research identifying a large part of Mary Astell's library within the old library of Magdalene College. A lot of what I touch on today has been accepted for publication in The Library, the journal of the UK Bibliographical Society. But I will reflect on aspects of my research which may be of particular interest to you. For example, Mary Astell's interaction with texts in French. I wish this was a portrait of Mary Astell we see here, but unfortunately there is no known portrait in existence. This image has been used a few times as a representation of Astell. It is a frontispiece to Jacques Dubosc's book, The Excellent Woman, from 1692. We see here an unknown woman with her library collection and sitting at her desk, so we can see why this image may have been used to depict Astell. We see here the old library of Magdalene College, where the Mary Astell books form part of its collection. It is the collection of books and manuscripts amassed by Magdalene since its formation as a Benedictine hostel in 1428. The college is also home to the Pepys Library, the personal library of Samuel Pepys, which came to the college in 1724. But the two libraries are treated as completely separate entities, occupying different spaces within the college. The Pepys Library is very much a gentleman connoisseur's private library of the 17th century that is still in its original form, including the original bookcases. However, the old library has been growing over a much longer period of time, absorbing the book collections of many individuals associated with the college, and is still being added to in the present day. So where did all these books in Magdalene College Old Library come from? In many of the old libraries of Cambridge colleges, bequests of books from former masters and fellows form a major part in augmenting their collections, and this is certainly the case with Magdalene. Some of the major benefactors to the library are former masters of the college. For example, James Duport, a scholar of classics, theologian Peter Peckard, who is known chiefly for his anti-slave trade views, and Daniel Waterland, a theologian and a bibliophile, and we will return to him later. On a smaller scale, there are many other individuals' books which have been donated or bequeathed to the old library. There are lots of male donors featured, of course, but the old library does contain donations by women. Two of these women are mentioned in the old library's Register of Donors, a 17th century manuscript recording gifts of books by prominent donors, which unfortunately wasn't kept up for very long. The two women mentioned in the register are Frances Ray, the Countess of Warwick, daughter of Sir Christopher Ray, an alumnus of the college. Also mentioned is Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, who gave her published works to the college, as she did with many other colleges in Cambridge. One can see that the scribe neglected to paint her coat of arms, as they did with Frances Ray's entry. However, Mary Astell's collection has emerged as one of the most striking out of all of the donations given to the old library, and is certainly the largest collection of books owned by a woman in the old library. Astell was born in 1666 and was the daughter of Peter and Mary Astell, a coal merchant family from Newcastle, and so she enjoyed the material benefits of a prosperous household. Her education was relatively sophisticated. Astell's uncle Ralph, who had no children of his own, became her educator and found her to be a willing pupil. Ralph Astell was curate at the Church of St. Nicholas, Newcastle, shown here. This is not quite a contemporary image, it dates from the 1780s, but it nevertheless gives an impression of Mary Astell's hometown and the church she knew. Ralph Astell immersed Mary in the teachings of the Cambridge Platonists, a group of academics at the University of Cambridge in the mid-17th century, under whom he had studied. Then Mary Astell moved to London after a decline of the family's finances upon the death of her father, most likely around 1688, the time of the Glorious Revolution, which sparked riots in Newcastle. She successfully petitioned William Sancroft, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to finance her early writing career. Professor Ruth Perry, Astell's biographer, writes, "Whatever difficulties Astell endured when she came to London, she did not stop reading and thinking about philosophy." As an unmarried woman attempting to establish herself as a writer, Astell positioned herself outside societal norms, but nevertheless was admitted into London's intellectual sphere, almost exclusively a male preserve. As the few other women of Astell's day found, entry into this circle of scholars was helped enormously by an introduction from an established male. Male-female intellectual pairings, such as Damaris Masham and John Locke, and Henry Moore and Lady Anne Conway, were certainly a key factor in the publication of women writers' work, though Astell, unlike Masham and Conway, was unmarried, an additional hurdle to navigate in society in her pursuit of paid work as an author. Astell formed such an intellectual pairing with John Norris, philosopher and clergyman, after Astell wrote to Norris to challenge him on his published claims. Norris was so impressed with Astell's talent as a rhetorician and her lively writing style that he sought permission to publish their correspondence. While the publication, under the title Letters Concerning the Love of God, was in the planning stage, Astell published a serious proposal to the ladies in 1694, her argument for establishing communities of learning for women. Letters Concerning the Love of God appeared a year later, and the two books established her as a prominent thinker and writer. Residing in Chelsea, Astell befriended many illustrious aristocratic women, such as Lady Elizabeth Hastings and Lady Catherine Jones, who also acted as patrons for her writing. These women also provided financial support for Astell and her project in later life, establishing and becoming the head of a charity school for girls in Chelsea in 1709. After a successful period of writing philosophical works, arguments for the education of women, and political pamphlets, she ceased writing to focus on her charity school until she left its headship in 1724. In 1731, Astell died of breast cancer, having lived her last years with her friend and supporter, Lady Catherine Jones. So, how was Mary Astell's personal library identified? It was an unexpected and very pleasing outcome of the work I have been doing to make Magdalene College's old library collection more visible to academic researchers and the wider public. Due to limited online cataloguing of the collection, I wanted to produce an online resource which could be helpful to show what books were in the library. My ultimate goal is to have all of the old library's books recorded on the University of Cambridge's online library catalogue called iDiscover. However, this is a very time-consuming process. Therefore, I thought the best way of making progress would be to compile a straightforward online list of the old library's holdings, so that there is a resource available for people to search the collection. This is a screenshot of part of it, the old library shelf list, which is searchable and is a good temporary measure while I now begin the more detailed book cataloguing to international standards. I should say that all of the Mary Astell collection has now been catalogued more fully and is available to view on the university's online catalogue, iDiscover. In compiling this shelf list, I decided to include provenance information of each book and whether there is marginalia in the books, as this is a very common inquiry librarians receive from researchers. And it was this research which led to the identification of Astell's books. It took me about 5 years to compile the whole old library shelf list alongside my other duties. So there was a very long research process associated with the identification of these books owned by Astell. Sorry about the picture of me, but it illustrates the books, Astell's books rather nicely. And this is what the Astell collection looks like. I have identified 42 volumes formerly owned by Astell, and one of these volumes is quite different from the others. It contains several short pamphlets concerning the English Reformation and the Church of England, and quite a few of these pamphlets are from the 16th century. And it may have possibly have been owned previously by Astell's uncle, Ralph. So in terms of separate items, there are 92 separate book titles I have identified, but 47 of these are bound into this one large volume of pamphlets. But considering the collection as a whole, 10 of the titles were purchased by Astell, as shown by her handwritten dates of acquisition and prices paid. Another 13 titles were gifts and bequests, where either Astell notes the name of the person giving the gift, or there is other evidence, such as distinctive bindings identifying particular books as gifts. In another 8 titles, Astell enters a date of acquisition only. It is likely that in the absence of any recognition of these items as gifts, that these books were also purchased. The remaining 61 titles do not contain conclusive evidence as to when or how they were acquired, but contain marginalia and notes identified as being in Astell's own hand. In terms of languages represented in the collection, 69 of the titles are in English, 16 in French, and 7 in Latin. The first of Astell's books to be identified were the ones with the most obvious markings, those books in which she had written her full name or initials, which happens frequently when she receives the book as a gift. The time period of the inscriptions and other names being mentioned in the inscriptions all certainly suggested that these books belonged to the Mary Astell, philosopher and author. This is one such example, the inscription M. Astell, April the 19th, 1709, the gift of the most ingenious and pious author. The author of this book is her colleague John Norris, Astell's correspondent and mentor. So the date of receiving this book and the relationship between the two parties all confirms the provenance of this book really neatly. Here is another example, the inscription on the upper end paper, M. Astell, St. James's Day, 1723, part of the legacy left by Mrs. E. Methuen, who died July 4th, 1723. This is Elizabeth Methuen, Astell's friend and nearest neighbour to her home in Chelsea. So again, another very neat example of confirming the book's provenance, thanks to Astell's detailed inscription. The notes on this book about the geometry of the triangle give a hint to Astell's ability in mathematics and physics, and indeed we know she studied with John Flamsteed, the Astronomer Royal, in 1697. And a third example here, M. Astell, February the 18th, 1709-10, the gift of the Right Honourable the Lady Elizabeth Hastings. It is highly likely that Elizabeth Hastings selected this particular title as a gift for Astell because the translator of the book is Elizabeth Elstob, a friend of Astell's and a prolific scholar of Anglo-Saxon. It also suggests that Astell could not afford to support Elstob by becoming a subscriber to the book herself. And indeed, Astell is not listed among the subscribers in the final pages, but Hastings is. Elizabeth Hastings was one of Astell's closest friends, and we know that she acted as a patron for her writing. But this example on the screen confirms that she also gave books as gifts. Having become familiar with Astell's writings, a circle of aristocratic women were keen to engage in intellectual exchanges with Astell and would receive book recommendations from her. Ruth Perry says that members of this circle, such as Lady Elizabeth Hastings and Lady Catherine Jones, that they took Astell under their wing due to her articulate presence and involvement in charitable activities. As we have seen, there are many books in Astell's collection which were given as gifts. Certainly, it's not unusual to recommend, exchange, and give books to friends. However, for Astell, books were an essential tool for her career in a way that was most unusual for an unmarried woman of this period. Therefore, receiving books as gifts would have been a very helpful part of the support that her friends offered her. These examples also show that Astell was not shy about writing on her books. We have seen that she does write her name on these books, but also that she writes supplementary notes. As a consequence of identifying these books, which were clearly formerly owned by Mary Astell, I then went back to look at books in the old library, which I knew had a large amount of notes and marginalia on, and I could then compare the handwriting with known examples of Astell's. Once I had a good grasp of Astell's handwriting and note-taking styles, during a very short period of time, I could identify a lot of her books in the library. However, this rapid identification process was only possible due to the original work of recording provenance information for the online Old Library shelf list, as I described earlier. In order to confirm that I was on the right track with the marginalia I was identifying, I contacted Professor Ruth Perry, who was able to verify the handwriting as Astell's, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying that she was very excited about these findings. By finding more and more examples of Astell-owned books in the library, I could then build up a very detailed picture of how Astell acquired and interacted with the books she owned. Books by French philosophers such as Nicolas Malebranche and René Descartes form a significant proportion of the collection. This is not too surprising. We know that Astell's mentor, John Norris, advised her to study the works of French philosophers. In Norris and Astell's published correspondence, letters concerning the love of God, Norris instructs Astell to consult the Amsterdam edition of Malebranche's De la Recherche de la Vérité and the Cologne edition of Malebranche's Méditation chrétienne. I can confirm that Astell's copies of these works have been found in the collection, as illustrated above, and the copy of De la Recherche de la Vérité in particular contains a lot of very interesting material evidence, which I will focus on in the next couple of slides. Astell told Norris, "I wish I could read that ingenious author in his own language." At the time, either Astell had already acquired some rudimentary knowledge of French, or she was beginning to learn French intensively by acquiring the books that Norris was recommending to her. From Astell's collection of books, we can now see that she evidently had a good working knowledge of French and interacted with these texts extensively. We see from the upper end paper of her copy of De la Recherche de la Vérité that Astell purchases this copy in Salisbury in 1695 and is in a very typically French binding, which confirms that she has bought this book at least second-hand, and this is a very typical feature of the books she is acquiring. She was certainly not buying books new. There is a gap on average of 12 years between the year of a book's publication and Astell's year of purchasing a book. It is also very interesting that she notes buying this book in Salisbury using the Latin version, Serum, and there has, up to this point, been no other evidence that Astell ever visited Salisbury. It strongly suggests that she would have met with John Norris in person, because he lived just outside Salisbury. We also see an interesting scribble. You might be able to see the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G above the date. This is evident on a few of the other books in the collection, and it seems to be Astell's way of hiding older inscriptions on books. Another clue that she was buying books secondhand. We also see on this end paper her use of pencil. There are a lot of markings and notes in pencil throughout her books, and this was one of the key details that helped me identify a lot of the books, as pencil annotations are very rare in the other books of the old library. On the title page, we see an inscription of a Latin motto in Astell's handwriting, Nolo virtute relicta invidiam pacare, which loosely translates as, "I do not want to subdue envy by abandoning virtue." There is strong evidence to suggest that Astell is using this motto as a response to a quotation from Horace, Invidiam placare paras virtute relicta, at the head of a satire printed in The Spectator in April 1712, attributed to Richard Steele but signed as Mary. There has been no previous evidence made to this particular Spectator issue satirising Astell, though there are other pieces from the Spectator which certainly did so, which is evidence of how well known she was in London at the time. This inscribed response by Astell in Latin to the Horace quotation seems to confirm that Astell thought this particular satire was attacking her. On the verso of the title page, we see lengthy notes by Astell about which editions of Malebranche's books she considered the best, including that the best edition of De la Recherche de la Vérité is the 5th, printed in Paris by Michel David, which Astell says, in which many alterations and additions I have inserted. This is the 4th edition, and in the back of the 2nd volume, Astell includes a lengthy extract from the 5th edition, which she has copied out by hand. So she must have had access to the 5th edition, but either she could not or would not purchase it. This practice speaks to her meticulous study of multiple editions of texts in their original language, in order to gain the fullest understanding possible. Though Astell often cited English translations of Malebranche's texts in her own work. It is highly likely that Astell was able to borrow and purchase books from Richard Wilkin, the printer and bookseller for Astell's own works. Ruth Perry surmises that Astell would spend time reading in Wilkin's shop, and I quote, "That was where Astell kept au courant, picking up and discussing the latest pamphlets with other writers and other browsers." Wilkin may well have afforded Astell the privilege of borrowing books from his shop as a prized client. Her fame in London would have attracted more customers into his premises. While the majority of notes within De la Recherche de la Vérité were copied out by Astell from a different edition of the same work, the notes in her copy of Descartes' Les Principes de la Philosophie are a mixture of brief translations into English and the margins, her own responses to the text, cross-references to other works, and copied and translated extracts from Bayet's biography of Descartes to complement the printed text for her own reference. The detailed notes relating to maths and science are particularly striking, and we see here her notes about lodestones. There are specific works which Astell refers to in her notes in this book, such as Borellis's De Vive Percussionis. It would certainly be possible to do a whole conference paper just on this book alone. And this, of course, is only a small sample of books in the collection. One of the major questions to arise from this reconstruction of Astell's library is how the collection ended up at Magdalene. We know that Astell made a will as a single woman with belongings, and we know the name of Astell's executrix, Elizabeth Hutcheson, a friend of Astell's. But unfortunately, no copy of the will survives. Some of Astell's books found their way into the library of Kingscliff, Northamptonshire, in the village where Elizabeth Hutcheson resided and can be seen here on the top left. The library books are now kept at Northamptonshire Record Office. However, the much larger grouping of books at Magdalene suggests that the college was the principal benefactor of her library collection. The only suggestion of a link between Magdalene and Astell is that Daniel Waterland, the master of the college between 17 and 1740, who I mentioned earlier, was evidently a fan of Astell's and cited one of Astell's works in his book, Advice to a Young Student, and calls her an ingenious lady. During Astell's later years, Magdalene was in a period of active book collecting. Waterland, who was previously responsible for the logistics behind the donation of Bishop John Moore's library to Cambridge University, was well equipped to set up the Pepys Library when it arrived at Magdalene in 1724. According to the published college history, and I quote, "The arrival of the Pepys collection probably stimulated awareness of the poor state of the foundation library. The college was now the reasonably proud possessor of one of the world's great libraries, and had been shamed into taking its own original humble library provision more seriously." It is certainly possible that Astell was aware of the Pepys Library arriving at Magdalene. The event was announced in contemporary newspapers, and Astell and Pepys had mutual acquaintances such as Hans Sloane. Waterland was a popular master of Magdalene, and under his stewardship, a number of benefactions for scholarships was made to the college, so it is entirely possible that he would take an interest in brokering donations of books to the college, especially from a figure with whom he shared academic and charitable interests, such as Mary Astell. He was also a client of Richard Wilkin, Astell's printer and bookseller, so you never know, they may have coincided at Wilkin's bookshop. The only contemporary or near contemporary evidence, I should say, of Astell's intention of bequeathing her books to Magdalene can be found at the Bodleian Library in the manuscripts of her biographer, George Ballard, the author of the book Memoirs of Several Ladies of Great Britain, published in 1752, in which Astell appears. In Ballard's draft manuscript for the book, he concludes his chapter on Astell by stating, "She gave her library, which was a pretty large one, to Magdalene College in Oxford." Crucially, the "in Oxford" has been deleted, which is surely a result of Ballard finding no evidence of Astell's book in the library there. And this also happened to be his own college, so he knew it well. However, it is evident by Ballard's deletion, but allowing the words Magdalene College to stand, that he was aware of Astell's library being at Magdalene College, Cambridge. The note in Ballard's manuscript reveals that it was a deliberate decision of Astell's to leave her library to Magdalene College, Cambridge. Unfortunately, these details are not mentioned at all in the published version of Ballard's book, which has surely contributed to the library being unidentified as Astell's beneficiary for nearly 300 years. Two of the Astell collection books bear the inscription, "The gift of Mrs. Astell to Magdalene College, Cambridge." One we have seen here on this title page I showed earlier. The inscriptions are not in Astell's hand, nor in her usual brown ink, but in an 18th century hand using black ink, which appears in other books in the old library. It is likely, therefore, to be the hand of a person associated with the college, and further confirms that it was an active choice by Astell to give her library to Magdalene College, Cambridge. So to conclude, the Astell collection at Magdalene College is an atypical and fascinating example of women's book collecting spanning the 17th and 18th centuries. It is highly unusual to find a female-owned collection of books which was used to inform the owner's published works. Astell was in the highly unusual position of being a female scholar and author living by her pen, and she benefited from enlightened family members who gave her an education, and from friends and patrons who recognized her intellectual gifts. The books by Descartes and Malebranche in the Astell collection are some of the most heavily annotated, but it is possible that there are completely unmarked books formerly owned by Astell present in Magdalene's old library. The books which I have identified in the collection largely align with Astell's writing career and markedly drop off after 1709, when her charity school activities took over. Evidently, she did not have the means to buy books new. She received books as gifts and also borrowed and exchanged books, as we know from other documentary evidence. The focus of my work is certainly on the bibliographical aspects of the Astell collection, and I certainly wouldn't class myself as a scholar of Astell or her writings, or as an expert in 17th and 18th century philosophy or theology. I am very keen for the collection to be researched further by others, and I hope that from the examples I have given today, this will inspire academics in the field to use my research as a gateway for more detailed work into the Astell collection. I'm hoping that my journal article will be published in September, but there has already been one exciting discovery made following on from my work by an academic researcher. Professor Ruth Perry decided to take a look at electronic versions of the anonymous 18th century pamphlets owned by Mary Astell. And this was all happening during COVID, while we were all heavily relying on electronic library resources. While having a read through this particular pamphlet online, an inquiry into the nature of the liberty of the subject, Perry immediately recognized the proto-feminist aspects of the text, amongst many other characteristics, all strongly pointing towards Astell's authorship. Therefore, through the discovery of Astell's library, we have also been able to discover previously unidentified works by Astell herself, and the full findings of Perry's investigation of this pamphlet have been published in the journal 18th Century Studies. I'm really interested in seeing what other publications and projects appear as a result of this work. And indeed, I'm already aware of some in the pipeline, and the library has received several inquiries already. There is a lot of scope for further research by experts in many fields: philosophy, political thought, the history of science, or feminist viewpoints, to name a few. And therefore, I hope that any outcomes of the identification of these books will embody a successful collaboration between special collections librarians and academic researchers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this fascinating paper and for talking us through the process of discovery. Maybe if you can stop sharing for now, and then unless people, and maybe you can share again if you want to go back to slides. Okay. Then I can see who's raising their hands for questions. But before we go to questions, maybe we can give a round of applause to Catherine for the 5 years well spent, I feel, doing this cataloging work, which opens, as you said, a lot of doors for research to come, which is really exciting in all these different fields. As people gather their thoughts, I have a very sort of material culture question. I was interested, and I'm not by any way a 17th century philosophy specialist, so my question is very material based. You said a very distinctive French binding to the book. So is there this is really curiosity, but is there a kind of national characteristics to book bindings?
Yes, definitely. It's mainly, I wish I could bring out an example from my own collection, but unfortunately not. Maybe if I can share my screen again, yes, go straight back to it, see if I can find it. The picture with me in it, which is unfortunate. So in the picture, you can see the two tall books on the left-hand side, and then the next two along, they're the Descartes, and you can see the decoration on the spine, that kind of tooling. I call it tooling. I'm not sure what it is in French. That sort of delicate style of tooling is, you can see, oh yes, that is a French binding.
Okay.
Yes,
so it's the decoration on the spine that tells you.
Yes, yeah. and it makes a nice change because most of the bindings in the old library are very plain. But yes, you can see that they're definitely a French binding, and therefore confirm that Astell was buying them secondhand.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So if you have questions for Catherine, please just unmute yourself and ask your question. Or you can raise your hand as well if you don't want to take the liberty of unmuting yourself, but Guyonne.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to ask you a question about the book with pamphlets. How many pamphlets could you find in that book?
Yes, there's a large volume of pamphlets, and I think there are about 47-ish pamphlets in that particular volume, and that volume is quite an outlier compared to the rest of the collection. The rest of the collection is things I would expect to find from Astell's library, due to who the author was or the time period. Most of the books, are late 17th century, early 18th century, but these are quite a bit older and not particularly in her field of study. But nevertheless, it has a contents list written in her handwriting. So I do wonder whether that might have belonged to her uncle, given a generation before, and his theological interests. That's a guess. But there are other pamphlets in the collection, but they are tend to be more on political theory of the early 18th century. And as we've seen, one of them we think is by Astell herself. So these are much more sort of typical of the books and pamphlets that I've discovered in her collection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you.
To go off that, so I'm not obsessed by bindings, but so like, for instance, the pamphlets that you found in this book, collected in this book, who would have bound that? Like, you would go to your bookbinder and you would, so that presumably you think it's the uncle or her, but maybe the uncle who would have collected those in this particular order and asked them to be bound.
Yes, that is possible. Or he himself could have bought it secondhand, already bound. But at that time, if you were buying a book new, you would buy it without a binding on, and then get it sent to your binder to have it bound in the particular style that you wanted. So going to Pepys now, that's definitely what he did, and he describes that in his diary. And the more money you had, the better, the more fancy bindings you could choose in the fashion of the day.
Thank you very much. Hélène Vidal, if you want to ask your question, go for it.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned the books that she borrowed and exchanged. So do you have other titles that you would be tempted to add to the list that you already have? So did you find evidence of more books?
Well, yes. So in Ruth Perry's excellent biography of Mary Astell, there's a great appendix section at the end, which transcribes all of Mary Astell's correspondence with her friends, and in those it gives different titles. And in the marginal notes in the books that I found, she mentions these other books, so she must have read those. But also in the old library, there are books to do with the education of women. I just maybe one or two examples that I think, oh, this must have been hers, but unfortunately there's no evidence that no concrete evidence she hasn't marked them. And unfortunately we don't have in our college archives any details of when, each exact title, who donated them. We have some evidence, but not for all of the books in the library. So yes, I'm sure that there are books that are completely unmarked in the library which were hers, which is very frustrating. But
the question is really where to draw the line when we're creating a list of the books that belonged to someone, because I'm trying myself to recreate the Duchess of Devonshire's library, and I'm trying to work from some from the correspondence, but also from inventory, and it's work in progress.
yes, it's tricky, and that sounds great, and I'm sure lots of research trips to Chatsworth would be be very enjoyable. But I've tried to be quite conservative. I've only put in my list the things which I know for definite, because I'm not a full-time academic, so I want to make sure that I was quite cautious with how to attribute the books to Mary Astell, and to then get Ruth Perry to double check the handwriting on them.
Thank you very much.
Sarah?
Yes, and thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering about the quality of the annotations and what you concluded about the kind of things that how she placed her annotations around the text, and what sort of message might be coming through. I mean, I'm always very fascinated by the scribblings around a text, and I was thinking a little bit of in Wuthering Heights, Catherine's annotations on the pages of the novel, and the whole notion of annotating and making a book your own, and also it's somehow a kind of public act as well to annotate, because you're speaking to everybody, you're trying to make your point. And
yes,
I wondered if you'd had any thoughts on that.
Yes, in one of the Descartes books, she puts in the margins small translations in English of the bits I suppose she wanted to really highlight. So that definitely tells me she had a very good knowledge of French, and also she wasn't shy about giving her opinions. In some cases she says, this is false, this is wrong, so there's certainly an assertive personality there, I think. But also in some of the books she creates her own index at the back if there isn't one in the book already. So I think that definitely speaks to how thoroughly she read the books and how really seriously she was taking them, because most of her acquaintances were reading them really for their education, but it was as a leisurely activity. But for Astell, it was also her career, something different. So I think the annotations really speak to that.
And has anyone written on that, an article or?
On Astell in particular. My one will be coming out in September in the library, but we also have had some scholars. It's a project in Australia that looks into how women used books, marginalia in books, and really sorry, I can't remember the exact title of the project. It will come back to me, but please do email me if you'd like
Very much.
like more details on that.
Thank you.
Just maybe to go off that comment, I was really fascinated to hear you go through different types of conversations that are going on. So there's the conversation with the text. There's also the conference, or the conversation between, which is a type of conference, between, she puts in relationship or in conversations different editions for the same work. And then there's also the kind of private public thing that Sarah's comment hinted at when it comes into print, into the spectator. And there is another type of conversation or answer to something that's been published, presumably about her, or at least she feels it's about her, in something that is more of a private comment, but still acknowledges somewhat publicly that. So I just wanted to maybe have your thoughts on that, on those different levels of conversation. And if you can relate this is my material mind speaking, about a comment you made about pencil, that she wrote in pencil as opposed to, and then you also commented about the type of ink she uses, brown ink as opposed to black ink, and she puts her name in ink from the images you showed, but then some of the comments are in pencil. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that choice of pen?
I do wonder if pencil was cheaper. I mean, that's the thing that really springs to mind, because something from Ruth Perry's biography is that comes through is that Astell really, she wasn't really well off. She had to rely on friends, and so she was living a very frugal lifestyle. So I'm not really an expert on the prices of the ink or pencil compared to ink, but I would guess that pencil was cheaper. That's one thought that comes to mind. And yes, I do agree with you that there's lots of different layers to how she marks her books, whether they were all for her consumption or whether she was, she was thinking of it in mind for publications as well. There's this is something that I would really like others to come and explore as well, because I've mainly done the analytical work, so with the more wider philosophical type thoughts on this, I would love for people to come and see them, and yes, maybe publish on it as well.
Thank you. Does anybody have a question, or maybe one last question for Catherine? Hélène?
Yes, you mentioned books in French. Do you have other titles or other categories of French writings that you could tell us about? What kind of books were there?
Yes, they are all of the philosophical nature. And perhaps if oh, this might be too ambitious, but I could share the screen and try and get, where are we? I will try to get to the university's online catalogue, and I can show you how to access the list of the books.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, bear with me. I'm just there. Okay. So, and this is the Cambridge iDiscover page, and if you Google that, you should be able to find that. Descartes. I'm just going to narrow down the search so I definitely find something at Magdalene rather than in all the other libraries in Cambridge. And on the right hand side, you can filter filter the search so it's just Magdalene. So these are the ones by Descartes, and if you go into each record, you should see collections, Magdalene College, the Astell collection. Now, if you click that, this will bring up everything in the Astell collection. So then you should see all of, there's Malebranche, Descartes. Oh, Jean Laplaquette.
Yeah.
So this is where you'll find all of the collection, and you can check.
Thank you very much. I will have a look. Thank
Okay.
you for showing us.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for this guided introduction to, this is a really useful resource to be able to kind of have the whole collection there.
Yes.
In the one place, and then go into each record. Thank you very much.
Okay.
You really made a tremendous work.
Oh, thank you.
Really.
Thank you. Yes, I think rare books cataloging is very time consuming because we have to describe the binding and the provenance and everything. So compared to cataloging a modern book, it takes a long time.
But it is very fruitful, and it will be more and more fruitful, I think.
Yes.
Really, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's
Too much, I think.
thank you very much. Well, I think that's going to be all for tonight. We're just on time. I'll just announce the next month's session, where we'll be staying with material culture and the early modern period, but we'll be listening to Lauren Working from the University of York talk about tobacco and material culture and the wit sociability. And that's going to be on April the 18th on Zoom. So with the same channel of communications through Twitter and everything. So if you're interested, do tune in. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.